Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And it truly is an honour to speak in support of our Opposition Day motion for the Liberals not to increase the carbon tax. And I just want to give you a couple of quotes from agriculture producers that I met with this summer, including a farmer in Ontario who told me the only threat to the success of his family farm is Liberal government policy. A Saskatchewan farmer: when it comes to farming, I feel like I'm digging my own grave to follow my dream. In fact, a recent survey showed that Canadian farmers, the biggest stressor to farm families is not commodity prices, it isn't weather, it's government policy and regulation. I would say for the first time, Canadian farmers see their government as an adversary, not an ally. This is having a huge impact on the financial and mental health of our Canadian farmers. According to a survey on farmer mental health by the University of Guelph, 75% of farmers have mid to high stress levels, and farmers are 4 times more likely to commit suicide than any other part of the general population. This is the kind of stress and anxiety that our Canadian farm families are facing. And their #1 stressor is government policy and regulations imposed on them by the Liberal government. And let's take a moment to look at a couple of those things before I get into the depth of the carbon tax. Last November, the Minister of Environment and Climate Change announced there'd be a fertilizer emissions reduction of 30%, with no consultation and no idea exactly what that would mean. But now that's putting further pressure on Canadian farm families on what they're going to do to make themselves economically viable, as they are going to be taking away some of the most important tools that they have. Why is this government not looking at our Canadian farm families, the hardworking Canadian farm families, our innovators, our agri-food businesses, and our researchers, who are a critical part of the climate change solution? Instead, they're almost looking at them with disdain, instead of looking at them as part of the solution. For example, in 1981, the average farmer was getting about 27 bushels to the acre. Now they are getting more than 50. But the kicker on that is they're doing that on less than half of the acreage, significantly reducing their carbon footprint. Did they get any credit for that whatsoever? No. On average, we are 50% more efficient in fertilizer use than any other country on the face of the earth. Do Canadian farmers get any credit for that? No. So instead, when it came to this fertilizer emissions reduction policy, here's the narrative the Liberal government should have had. When the European Union started making massive cuts to fertilizer use and livestock production, that's their decision. But the Liberal government should have said, okay, you have an issue in the European Union. Why not look at what we're doing here in Canada? Why not look at our innovators, our farmers, our experience, our technology, practices like precision farming, variable rates, 4N nutrient stewardship. Show Canadians just how impressive Canadian agriculture is. But instead, their fallback every single time is to look at Canadian farmers, much like they do our energy workers, as the enemy, rather than part of the solution. And even so, the parliamentary budget officer said that even if you increase the carbon tax to $170 a ton, do you know what the impact on emissions from agriculture is? 0. The reason is there's no other options. Our farmers, certainly right now, that many of them are in the combine, they can't fuel that with anything other than diesel. They can't put as one of my Liberal colleagues told me a few months ago, they can't put a solar panel on top of that machine. It runs 24/7. They don't have any other options. This is what they do to ensure that they can not only feed Canadians, but feed the world. And now I'd like to focus on the carbon tax specifically. And we heard it again today in question period. In the answer to one of the questions from my colleagues, the parliamentary secretary said, well, farmers are exempt from the carbon tax on all farm fuels. Patently not true. Some fuels are exempt, but fuels like natural gas and propane are still subject to the carbon tax. So the Liberals are either misleading Canadians, misleading Canadian farmers, or they really don't understand their own policy. And the parliamentary secretary said in committee that even talking to his farmers, and he talked about it again in question period today, that, well, we have C8. We have a farm carbon tax rebate. Now, the message from the Liberals always is that carbon tax is revenue neutral. Well, we now know from Ontario grain farmers and from the Department of Finance and from the Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Agriculture that that is also not true. Farmers are getting less than 30%, and in some cases less than 15% of what they're paying on the carbon tax through that rebate from the Liberal government. In fact, the Department of Finance said the average farmer was getting $800 a year through the carbon tax rebate. $800. I can tell you I've seen the carbon tax bills from some of my farmers, especially large poultry operations, large dairy operations, certainly our grain growers here in Ontario who are drying grain or heating barns. Their carbon tax bills are in the thousands and in sometimes tens of thousands of dollars a month. So I say, when you hear the Finance Department say, well, it's revenue neutral, they're getting $800 a month. That is a slap in the face to Canadian producers, who are certainly carrying the burden of the carbon tax, which has basically become wealth distribution on the back of Canadian agriculture. So when a Canadian farmer is getting between 13 to up to maybe 30 on a good day in their carbon tax rebate, you can see why, as the opposition, the Conservative Party, we are so adamant that we cannot see this carbon tax continue to rise and triple to $170 per ton. And the Canadian Federation of Independent Business also basically ratified and confirmed the numbers from the Ontario grain farmers, saying the carbon tax in the first year, the average farm paid about $14,000 in carbon tax. When it went up this previous April 1st, the average farm is now paying $45,000 in carbon taxes. I'm not sure, my math isn't always the greatest, but $45,800, there's a big gap. There's a big gap there that certainly shows that the carbon tax is not revenue neutral. And the frustrating thing is the Finance Department knows it, the Minister of Agriculture knows it, and yet they continue to allow this to happen. The Minister of Agriculture is complicit in seeing Canadian farmers be taxed to death. They're going to be losing their businesses. Now, we have put forward two private members' bills, one in the previous Parliament and one in this Parliament. This one is C234, which will exempt the carbon tax from all farm fuels. I'm very happy to say that we have the support of all the opposition parties, the Conservatives, the Bloc, the NDP, and the Greens. The holdout is the Liberal Party, the government, who still doesn't see that this was an error, that the carbon tax should be exempt on all farm fuels, not just a couple. This is imperative to the financial success of Canadian farmers. Because what's happening is those costs, farmers are the ones that are paying the carbon tax over and over and over again. Buying fuel, buying feed, buying fertilizer, transporting grain, transporting cattle. They're paying that carbon tax every single time. And Canadian consumers, here's the kicker, Mr. Speaker. Many Canadian consumers see this as an agriculture problem, a rural issue. Farmers have nowhere to pass those costs on. The result of that is when we are seeing food prices up more than 10%, the highest rate of inflation on food in more than 40 years. This impacts every single Canadian in every single corner of this country, as many Canadians are unable to put food on the table. And by tripling this carbon tax, is what we're asking the Liberals not to do in a time of record inflation. They are demanding Canadians to pay more to fuel their out-of-control spending. They're demanding seniors pay more. They're demanding youth pay more. They're demanding single mothers to pay more. They're demanding our small business owners to pay more. And they're certainly demanding our Canadian farmers to pay more. It is nonsensical, especially in a time of global food insecurity, where we need our Canadian agriculture to be pumping on all cylinders, firing on all cylinders, to meet the demand that we're going to see not only here at home, but around the world. So I'm asking my colleagues from all parts of this House, support our Opposition Day motion to ensure that the financial and the mental health of our Canadian farmers is first and foremost, because they are part of the solution. They are not the problem. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.